Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neal Bellon.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to begin by reviewing the poll results that I posted. I had put something on Twitter and Spotify, and here was the question. Your higher-rated opponent in an over-the-board chess game is an experienced tournament player. He forgets to press his clock and time pressure. Do you remind him? Very interesting scenario, and this came about because there was a situation at the club where it was two experienced tournament players. They had about 3-4 minutes each on the clock, so definitely both in time pressure. And more than once, the higher-rated opponent, who's an experienced tournament player, forgot to press his clock, and the other player reminded him, and I thought it was a great show of sportsmanship. So I put that out there. Would you remind your opponent to press his clock? And again, this is assuming that your opponent is an experienced tournament player who knows the deal, who should know better, who is aware of that. I think most of us, if we were playing a beginner, we would probably remind them. That would be kind of rough not to. I think most people would. I mean, some wouldn't, of course, but the question was, if your opponent is experienced, would you still do it? And on Twitter, most people said no. 47.1% said no. And then the remaining half was about 2/3, 1/3. So 35.3% said yes, they would remind him. And then 17.6% said it depends. The Spotify results were remarkably similar, where most people said no, and then it was split with the remaining 50%, about 2/3 said yes, and then the other 1/3 said depends. So on Spotify, 46.2% of respondents said no, they would not remind their opponent, and 38.5% said yes, and 15.4% said it depends. We didn't get too many votes. I wanted some more, but I understand a lot of people don't like to do these things, but it was interesting. And for me personally, it does depend. I mean, if it's someone at my club who I'm going to see every week, if it's a friend, if it's someone I know, I probably would remind them. I mean, if it was a real tense game and I really wanted to win, I mean, I probably would like milk it for a little bit, but I would tell them. That's kind of cheesy not to. But if I'm on a major weekend tournament and I don't know my opponent from Adam, if it's a total stranger, someone I'm not going to see again, I'm going to be honest, I'm probably not going to say anything because it's so hard, it's so competitive now that any edge that I can get that's legal and within the bound of ethics, I would adhere to. Now, I don't really think it's unethical to remind your opponent to press his clock, especially if it's someone that you may not know. But I'm just being honest. If it's a complete stranger and it's like a major weekend tournament, I'm probably not going to say anything. And if it helps me get the win, so be it. But if it's someone I know or if it's at my club, then I would remind them. Now, another situation where I would remind my opponent to press his clock, even if I don't know him, even if he's a stranger, would be if I'm completely winning, like it's overwhelmingly winning. I'm crushing my opponent and he just refuses to resign and he forgets to press his clock. I might say something because I just want to move. Or, of course, if it's a complete beginner or if it's someone who's maybe older, a senior citizen who I know doesn't see well, that type of thing. But I mean, if it's a relatively young guy and he's an experienced tournament player and it's someone I don't really know, I'm going to be honest, knowing myself, I probably wouldn't say anything. But if it's someone I know from the club, then I would. That's the right thing to do. But with both polls on Twitter and Spotify, most respondents said no, they would not remind their opponent. So some interesting results there. And now let's dive into our listener mailbag.
You've got mail.
Our first email is from Matt. He says, love the show and its practical advice for tournament players. I'm early in my chess career and currently rated about 1,000 ELO. On some days, I think I play above that, and on some days, my floor is lower than I'd like to admit. I had a question about trying to find out when to play up. Local tournaments in my area will typically have an open section, an under 1500/under 1600, and maybe an under 1000 section. What I'm finding is that when I play in the under 1500 sections, I feel really good about the games against the 1200 and 1300 rated players, but don't get real enjoyment from steamrolling the 4 to 500 rated players. Also, I've noticed that there are a lot of people in my area at approximately 1000 ELO and a bunch at approximately 1600, but there's not a lot in the 1000 to 1600 range. As I work to improve my game and hold my own against stronger opponents, I wondered what your thoughts were about playing up a section and allowing myself to get steamrolled by the 1800s. And then I thought that there could be a show topic on choosing a section based on goals, improvement versus financial gain, etc. But obviously you make the call on the show topics. Thanks for all the good content. Thanks so much for your email, Matt, and the kind words. I appreciate it. So a couple of things there. Now, what you said at the end about your goals for playing as far as improvement versus financial gain, the whole idea of playing, for financial reasons just to get a prize, that never really made sense for me. I guess because I'm doing it at the amateur level. For me, winning a prize is gravy. I play for improvement, for love of the game, and to boost my rating. Like, that's my main concern. I consider my tournament performance for any event to be successful if my rating has increased, even if it's gone up by 5 points, because it is very competitive now. But if I play a 5-round event, say at my club, and my rating goes up, say 12 points, 15 points, whatever it is, maybe even more, maybe just 5 or 6 points, I consider that a successful tournament. The only exception would be is if I had some really bad games along the way where I kind of slipped up, I was winning and kind of gave it away, and I had a few sloppy games. But if I generally played well and just faced some very tough competition along the way, as long as I see some increase in rating and I enjoyed myself, I consider it a successful tournament, and any prize money I might win is gravy. That's how I view it. Now, we can get into a whole discussion about financial gain and prizes and should that be changed to prevent cheating? That's a whole separate discussion for another day. But I really do it for improvement. And again, any prize I win, that's just icing on top. Now, as far as playing up, I spoke about this 2 weeks ago, I believe. I think playing up one section is actually a good idea because playing stronger players is how you're going to get better. It's like you said you're about 1,000. When you steamroll players rated about 400 or 500, it's nothing to really feel good about. It might help your ego, but if you're winning a game because you're playing someone rated 400 who hung his queen on move 5, well, you're not going to really learn from that. So as far as you getting steamrolled by those 1800 players, I know that's annoying, but those are the games that you're going to really learn from. Those are the games where you can put them in an engine or show it to a coach if you're working with someone like that, and you can really understand where you went wrong. Now, I know the way the sections are organized by you, there may not be a section where it's only one class higher than you. So it seems like you either need to kind of make a big jump or stay where you are. So I don't know what to tell you, but I mean, if you definitely want the challenge and you want to get better, I would play up. But ideally, you only want to play up just one section. But as a general rule, I do think it's a good idea. And I think in the long run, it will help your improvement, even though you may lose a lot of games initially. And remember, the bottom line, generally speaking, we're all going to learn a lot more from our losses than from our wins, for the most part. Now, of course, there are some times where we win, where sometimes that can be very, very instructive, especially if it's a game where you were losing most of the way and you had no business winning and you only won because your opponent made a horrible blunder at the end, that type of thing. But generally, we will learn much more from our losses than from our wins. So that's going to help you in the long term. Thanks so much for your email, Matt. Here's our next email. Dear Neal, I have listened to your podcast for about a year now, and I love it. I frequently follow your advice, For example, I bought The Amateur's Mind and Silman's Complete Endgame course. You made me realize I was spending too much time studying and not enough playing games. I was also focusing too much on tactics and openings and not enough on strategy. As for the openings, I haven't switched to the London system or French defense because I had already spent a lot of time studying the Vienna and Caro-Kann. But the main reason why I play the Queen's Indian against D4 was your repertoire and episode on it. Your podcast was definitely an important factor for getting me to 1000 ELO, and I would just like to thank you for making this podcast, which simultaneously entertained me on evenings and educated me about chess. Jacob from Germany. Well, Jacob, thank you so much. Shout out to our friends in Germany. Those are incredibly kind words, Jacob. I really appreciate it, and I'm glad you find the podcast helpful and that your journey is going well. Now, a couple of things about openings. You don't have to play. I don't want anyone listening to this to think that you have to play what I do, because I always say with this podcast, I'm sharing, I'm not telling. I mean, there might be some universal things where I am telling, where I talk about how you have to clean up your basic tactical mistakes first before you do anything else, and how you have to work on your time management. I mean, those are kind of universal. But as far as openings, I know I talk a lot about how I play the London as white and how as black against E4 I play the French, and against D4 I use the Queen's Indian and Nimo Indian. That's what I do, but I don't want people to think I'm saying that you should do that as well and that you should mimic my repertoire if you want to be successful. Not at all. I'm simply sharing what has worked for me. I'm sharing that I think system openings are an excellent idea and a viable option for busy club players who have limited study time and don't want to have to get bogged down with opening theory. Whereas if you play something like the Najdorf Sicilian, you're going to have to constantly stay on top of it. But as I always say, if you're playing the Najdorf and it's working out, then stick with it. So you say you're playing the Vienna and the Caro-Kann. If it's working for you, stick with it. As I've said many times, the real test, the litmus test to know if your opening repertoire is good, is if you're getting playable middle games on a regular basis. If you're getting to the middle game, regardless of whether you have white or black, and your position is equal, slightly better, or much better on a regular basis, then your opening repertoire is good. So stick with what works. And yeah, you say you play the Queen's Indian against D4. That's really one of my favorite openings, not only because it's easy to learn, it's very solid, but it works against a lot of setups. You can use the Queen's Indian not just against the traditional Queen's Pawn opening. You can use the Queen's Indian, as I do, against the London system. And let's face it, everyone's playing the London. Queen's Indian works very well against the London system. You've heard me say that. You can even use it against like an English opening or a lot of D4 pawn openings that are irregular, so to speak. Like what I'm seeing a lot of players do now, they'll play D4, I'll play knight F6, and then they'll do something weird. Like they won't play C4, they'll just play something strange. You can do a Queen's Indian setup against that. It works against almost anything other than E4. So it's a really, really flexible opening. I've had a lot of success with it, and I'm glad it's working out for you. So thanks again, Jacob, for your very kind comment. I wish you all the best. Our final email this week is also from Germany. So Germany is in the house this week. Big shout out. Dear Neal, I am writing from Germany to thank you for your excellent podcast. I have listened to nearly all of the episodes as I consider myself an adult improver, and I find your content very helpful. I started playing chess in my mid-30s, so I have a long way to go to get better. Nevertheless, I am still motivated. Today, I would like to share a quote with you that you may have already heard. The German-Polish chess player Johannes Zukertort allegedly said, "Chess is the struggle against the error." I am not sure if this is the correct translation of the quote. Let me just interject here, Lucas. Yes, it is. That is the quote from Zukertort. He did say chess is the struggle against the error, so he got it exactly right. And he continues, "In my opinion, this is excellent advice for chess players at all levels. My main goal in chess matches is to avoid errors. To achieve this, I solve tactic puzzles and review my own games to identify where these errors occurred to avoid it next time. I guess this approach is pretty common. As a lower level player, I equate Zukertort's error with a blunder. At a higher level, it may be considered a mistake or inaccuracy, quote unquote, but the goal of avoiding errors remains constant across different levels. It is important to remember that failing to capitalize on an opponent's error is also an error in itself. When I lose a game at my beginner level, it is often due to these errors, more or less, done by me. However, if I lose a game with no blunders and only 2 or 3 mistakes, again, different player levels need different definitions of error, I consider it a positive outcome and almost count it as a win for me. What are your thoughts on this quote? Do you believe it could serve as a guiding principle for chess players? Kind regards, Lucas. Well, thank you, Lewis, for that very insightful email. I like this a lot. And yes, you hit the nail on the head. This game, especially at our level, is ultimately a battle of mistakes. That's really what it's all about. And there's an expression you may have heard, whoever makes the next to last mistake wins. And mistake frequency is often what separates the rating classes because we like to think of it in terms of chess skill. For example, we say a 1600 player is quote unquote better than a 1400 player, or a 1400 player is better than a 1200 player, or a 1400 player is more skilled, let's say, than a 1200 player. But it's also about mistake frequency. And I look at it this way. And I remember many years ago, I had a conversation with National Master Rob Guevara, who was a guest on this podcast about this. Rob and I used to talk a lot, like after the club, after the last round was over, we would have some good conversations. And one of the things he told me that really sticks with me is that the rating differences is not so much about skill, but about mistake frequency. So a player rated 1800 is going to make fewer mistakes generally than a 1600 player. A 1600 player is going to make fewer mistakes than a 1400 player. A 1400 player is going to make fewer mistakes than a 1200 player, and so on down the line. And if you watch games at the club, you'll notice the higher rated the player is, generally the less mistakes they're going to make, at least in terms of blunders and sort of major mistakes. I mean, everyone's going to make inaccuracies and little slip-ups. 1900, 2000, 2100 players even do that all the time. But as far as actual mistakes where it's obvious to the other player that it's a mistake and he could take advantage of it, generally higher rated players aren't going to do that as much. So it ultimately is a battle of mistakes. And here's the thing. We can talk about openings, strategy, and theory and tactics, but the most important thing in amateur games is simply to not blunder. Just don't blunder. Again, slight mishaps or inaccuracies, those are going to happen. Amateur games are riddled with those. But if you simply don't hang anything and you don't blunder and you defend against basic elementary tactical shots, your rating's going to shoot up. It's going to increase, especially at the 1000 to 1200 level, which is where most players are at. If you look at the statistics, the overwhelming majority of chess players are somewhere between unrated and like 1300. So at that level, if you can just avoid those blunders, you're going to see your rating shoot up. I remember National Master Nick Figueredo. He was on the podcast. He was talking about his journey to master because when Nick was on the pod, he had just made 2200 a few months prior. So I was picking his brain about it. And ultimately what he was saying, this is what he did for himself. He goes, just don't blunder anything. Just stop making major mistakes. And that it's better to simply not blunder and don't make a mistake than to look for some brilliant tactical shot and then you force things and mess it up. So the idea that chess is the struggle against the error, it's absolutely true. At our level, it's ultimately a battle of mistakes. And again, whoever makes the next to last mistake wins. So I appreciate your email, Lucas. Very insightful. Best of luck with your chess progress. We're now going to take a short break. And when we come back, we have 2 more segments. First, I'm going to share my thoughts about what it's like being a playing TD, that is directing and playing in the same tournament. And then we're going to talk about beating higher rated opponents. That's coming right up. All right, a little bit of an interlude here. I want to speak for a little bit about what it's like being a playing tournament director. That is someone who both directs and plays in the same tournament. Now, a little bit about the rules. And again, I'm talking US chess here. In major events with large prize funds, such as those big weekend tournaments, you're not allowed, understandably, to both direct and play in the same event. However, in smaller club events, you are allowed to do so because the U.S. Chess Federation understands that most local clubs wouldn't exist if the tournament director couldn't play as well. I certainly would not run the club if I couldn't play as well. So you're allowed to do it. And I will tell you, being a playing tournament director, it is challenging because I get asked about that, like, how do you do it? I don't know how you do it. And it is challenging. Sometimes if I have trouble focusing or if I get distracted, that's legitimate. Like, that's not an excuse. That's a reason. So it is challenging playing as a tournament director. I don't like to use it as an excuse. I really don't. And I'm much better at dealing with it. And I think generally it doesn't affect my performance, but sometimes it certainly does. And it's not always easy. And I think about what it would be like to just show up and play. I mean, there was one time I remember where I was running late. I had something, I forgot if it was a family or a work thing, but I was running just maybe 10 minutes late. And so Tim Mirabile, National Master Tim Mirabile, who's our assistant tournament director, he's a friend, he's awesome. I said, Tim, can you just, he was playing in the event anyway. I said, Tim, because he's also a certified tournament director, I said, can you just get the tournament started? I go, I'm going to play, but I'm going to be a little bit late. So can you just kind of get the ball rolling? And he said, fine. And I remember I showed up. I actually ended up getting there just a few minutes late and they hadn't started yet. So I was basically on time and I get there and I'm like, oh my goodness. I'm like, this is amazing. Like I could just show up and play. I didn't have to do anything because Tim did it. I'm like, this is what it's like every week to not have to direct him to just play. So I'm thinking if I did that every week, but not complaining at all. I'm just saying that it can be challenging at times. And I sometimes think there's this tacit belief among the members that they like playing me. They like being paired against me because they know I'm the tournament director and they think I might get distracted. And that's true. That can be true. I mean, maybe not distracted, but definitely interrupted because I might have to make a ruling. And that can certainly throw me off. Here are some actual scenarios that I've had to deal with. And I'm not making this up. This is while I'm playing at the club. I will get players text me buy requests in the tournament hall during the round, like while I'm playing. Like they're in the room with me, they know I'm playing, and they're texting me buy requests at that time. Like, really, you couldn't wait till later? You had to do it right now while I'm playing? So that's something I deal with. I've also had players come up to me during the round while I'm playing to request a buy verbally, like, hey, Neal, I need a buy next week. They'll just walk right up to me. Now, I just want to be clear. They're not doing anything wrong and they have the right to do that. And I have to accept that that's part of playing and directing. I mean, part of me is thinking like, really, you couldn't wait till after to do this? Like you see that I'm playing, but this is what happens and things I have to deal with. In addition, one time the doorbell rang because we use the main hall of a church. We rent out the space there and it really is a nice playing space. There are other groups that use it and there's like a daycare there and stuff. And one time the doorbell rang. It was a package. I'm not sure if it was for the daycare or another group there. And this is in the middle of the game. So I hear the doorbell ring and then I had to pause my clock and sign for an Amazon package. Like these are things that happen during my game. So you're talking about keeping your focus during the game. That's sometimes tough to do. In addition, sometimes someone looking to play at the club, a new player will show up after the round starts wanting info about the club. It's like they'll show up and they'll just be like, oh, is the director here? And I'm in the middle of playing. It's tough for me because of course I want new members and I want them to feel welcome and I want their questions answered. Because if you're new to tournament chess, it can be somewhat daunting and overwhelming, but it's like I can't stop my game to talk to you now. So when they show up after the round has started, I'm just like, I'm sorry, I'm playing right now. Can you email me and then I'll answer all your questions because I really can't do it now. And sometimes they'll walk around and watch, but then I feel bad because they made a trip. But these are things that happen. And just a little bit of a tangent. One thing I learned about with new players, I'm curious if my fellow tournament directors listening agree with this. I don't take phone calls anymore about the club. I mean, because sometimes, at the club, I have my business card out in case anyone needs to get in touch with me. Sometimes they'll get my phone number from a friend or whatever, and I'll get phone calls like, hey, I'm calling about the Long Island Chess Club. I just had some questions. I went to your website, but I just want to speak to you about it. And what I used to do, I would call them back. They would keep me on the phone 15, 20, sometimes 25 minutes asking questions. So how does this work? And the entry fee and then the pairings, and then I have to keep score, and what equipment do I need? And I'll go through this whole thing. Oh, great, Neal. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for the info. I'll definitely be there this week. I'll definitely see you. And then they don't show up. They never show up. It's like I was on the phone almost a half hour, happily explaining everything, and they don't show up. This has happened so many times. So now I just don't take phone calls anymore. I mean, I'll email, but I'll just be like, we can do it by email. You can go on the website. You can stop by the club. But I just don't take phone calls anymore for that because it's just happened way too many times where they swear 6 ways till Sunday that they're going to show up and then they don't. And I just wasted a half hour. So that's something else I have to deal with as well. Now, getting back to being a playing TD, other times while I'm playing, I'm called to settle a dispute. And as my fellow tournament directors know, it's always the same people, right? Whenever there's an issue, it's like always the same people. It's the 80-20 rule. 80% of your problems are from 20% of the people, right? And that's fine. That's my job. I'm the TD. I'm there for that. But it does interrupt the thought process. Now, for those of you who are curious, there are 4 sort of incidents that are the most common where my involvement is requested. One is incorrectly set clocks. That happens all the time to a disturbing degree. In fact, many players will go an hour or more into the game before one of the players realizes that the clock is not set correctly. The other dispute is touch move, which can always get a little tricky. The third issue is non-scorekeeping. You have to keep score in a US chess tournament. The rule is as soon as either player has less than 5 minutes on the clock, then both players can stop keeping score if they wish. But just remember, if you stop keeping score, you can't claim a draw by threefold repetition. If you're going to claim a draw by threefold repetition, you have to have the moves on the score sheet to back that up and corroborate that. So keep that in mind. And then the fourth thing that I'm usually called over for is an illegal move, because a lot of players don't know how to handle that. So those are the 4 things: incorrectly set clocks, touch move, non-score keeping, and illegal move. And with non-score keeping, it's always the same people. It's amazing how this works. It's always the same people who don't keep score, and their reaction is always the same. Oh, well, I was going to. It's like it's the same song and dance. And then when you do look at their score sheet, there's like missing moves. It looks like a Picasso painting. It's like all over the place. What are you going to do? As such is the amateur level. Now, another sort of rule with this: when I'm called over as a playing TD, I am allowed to stop my clock to handle the dispute. That's in the rule book, or whatever TD business it is. So if I have to do tournament director business, I can pause my clock while I handle that, which is fair. Now, understand, I can't pause my clock if I just want to walk away from the board. I can't pause the clock if I want to go to the bathroom. But if it's for tournament director business and involving myself in another game because my presence is requested, I am allowed to stop the clock. But, and this is a big one, my opponent during that time, no matter how long it takes, can look at the position without any restrictions, which could be a huge disadvantage for me depending on the position. So if it's this real thorny position that's really tricky, and let's say I'm dealing with a touch move dispute or something that could take several minutes, my opponent gets to look at the board the entire time without the clock moving, which again can be huge. And in the past, do I think that has caused me a loss or maybe a draw where I should have won? Sure, but that's what I signed up for and I understand that. But it's something to think about. And then here's the larger point about all this. This is what sort of ties all this together. As many of you know, there are recent studies showing that when you task switch or you get interrupted from a task or a thought process, it can take like 20 minutes, up to 20 minutes to fully regain your focus, which is crazy if you think about it. So all those interruptions, that can really cause problems for me. So I just wanted to share my thoughts on being a playing tournament director. I hope that didn't come off as complaining. That's not what I'm doing. I'm simply sharing my world and what it's like. I think about how sometimes that does change the overall dynamic and the playing experience for me. Now we're going to change gears and I'm going to discuss playing high rated opponents, and I'm going to use a recent game as a point of reference to share my thoughts on that. So as far as high rated opponents, I'm going to start with a few general comments. I want to talk first about what I call the ratings walk. I've spoken about this before. For those of you who didn't hear me talk about this, the ratings walk, that's what I call it. It's a tell or a way that higher rated opponents sometimes telegraph that they're worried they may not win, that it may be a draw or a loss. And this sounds almost like I'm joking around, but there's definitely some truth to it. The rating walk is when your higher rated opponent walks over to the wall chart and starts doing like chess math because he's worried he might lose. So what happens is, if you're the lower rated player and you're doing well and you're holding your own, maybe you're even better, your higher rated opponent starts to get a bit nervous and he starts thinking about his own rating and the result. And when you get your opponent thinking about the result instead of the game, that's always a good thing. So again, I call it the ratings walk because they walk over to the wall chart and like I said, they start doing all this chess math. So that's a little bit of a tell. That may sound silly. It may sound like I'm just kind of messing around. But in my experience, there's definitely some validity to that. So if you think you're doing well against a high rated opponent and he gets up and does the ratings walk, that's a sign that he's probably worried and that should boost your confidence. So look for that. The other thing, when playing a high rated opponent, your attitude should be, I'm going to give my opponent a hard time and annoy him like crazy. I am going to drive you bonkers. That should be your attitude when you play a higher rated player. Because assuming, if he's destined to win the game, right? Because statistically he's higher rated, he's quote unquote supposed to win. Your attitude should be, I'm going to give you a great game. I am going to annoy you so much. I'm going to frustrate you. That should be your attitude. That's how you beat a higher rated opponent. Now, when I say annoy and frustrate, meaning on the board, meaning the game itself, not distracting behavior. That's against the rules. That's unethical. Now, you may say, well, why not think I'm going to beat you? Shouldn't your attitude be, well, I'm going to win. I'm going to beat you. The problem with that, it puts too much pressure on yourself. And you're assuming that you're more skilled than your higher rated opponent, and you're probably not. I mean, you might be on that given night. But if you say I'm going to beat you, again, it puts too much pressure on yourself and it's a little unrealistic. I had spoken about this before. Longtime listeners of the pod have heard me give this speech. And when I changed my attitude when facing higher rated opponents, when I changed my attitude to, I'm going to give you a good game. And if you think this is going to be some quick game and you're going to go home and watch the sports game, you've got another thing coming. I'm going to keep you here and give you a good game. And I'm going to annoy you and I'm going to make you say, wow, this low rated player is really giving me a hard time. Once I changed my attitude to that, instead of, well, I'm going to win, or instead of just becoming despondent right away and just assuming, well, I guess I'm going to lose because he's high rated. Once I changed that attitude to, I'm going to give you a heck of a game and annoy you, I ended up getting a lot of draws against higher rated players and some wins as well. But instead of losing most of my games to higher rated players, I started getting more draws and some wins. Another way of looking at it, this is kind of oversimplified, is I'm going to make the game last as long as possible. That type of thing. And there is nothing that a higher rated opponent hates more than a stubborn, lower rated opponent who will not give up. Jeremy Silman has said that. Other title players have said that. That's the way to beat a higher rated opponent. You need to get inside his head and frustrate him, because if you try to win it on just pure skill, that's going to be very difficult unless your higher rated opponent is having a bad night. You just want to play good moves, and your higher rated opponent just wants the game to be done. And when you see that you're making him work for it, that's where he's going to try and force things, because that's the psychology of it. What's going on? My opponent is quote unquote only 1,300. Like, how is he playing so well? How did he not hang a pawn already? I don't get this. And then it affects their ego. Well, is there something wrong with me? I'm 1,900. I should be beating this guy. And then they try to force something, and then you take advantage of it. You need to get inside their head. You need to win the psychological game. That's how you're going to beat the higher rated opponent. Just give them a good game. Just say, okay, if you're destined to win, I'm going to make you earn it. And when the game is over, you're going to be like, wow, you gave me a good game. You didn't make it easy. That's the way to do it. Now, I know that the common advice for beating higher rated opponents is that you should mix it up, right? If you're playing a high rated opponent, just go off book right away. Go for a wild, open, tactical, unbalanced position from the start. But here's the problem with that. You have to weigh that against your own comfort level and skill level. So fine, you might go into a position where neither of you have an idea what to do, but is he going to be able to handle that better than you can? See, I've tried to do that against higher rated opponents, and it ends up backfiring. For other people, it works. Now, where I think that works, the exception where I would go off book right away and just really mix things up and go out of my comfort zone, that would be if you're playing a significantly higher rated player. If you just try and play regular chess, you're going to get crushed. So in that situation, I would definitely mix it up. But if you're 1,400 and you're playing an 1,800 player, you can probably play your regular game. And I've beaten higher rated players by sticking to my normal approach. So again, if the gap is like ridiculous, it's almost silly how big the gap is between the players, then the only way you have a chance would be to mix it up, I think. Some people might fight me on that, but you can beat higher rated players by sticking to your regular game, but just being very stubborn, just being very solid. All right, because what could happen is you might mix it up to get your opponent off book, but you're going to end up being more confused than he is, and you might even lose even quicker. A lot of it has to do with how comfortable you are with that. You need to experiment with it. Maybe if you're 1,400 and you're playing someone who's only 1,700, maybe mixing it up right away will help you. I know for me, I only tend to really mix it up that way and go off book immediately if my opponent is almost like laughably higher rated than me. Like it's to a ridiculous degree. But most of the time, I just kind of stick with my own game. Now let's look at the game and what I learned from it. So a reminder with these game analysis episodes, what I do is it's not a move by move thing. It's not a blindfold chess thing. You don't need to be looking at a chessboard. So if you're in the car, if you're jogging, if you're walking the dog, you're fine. What I do is I use a game that I played as a point of reference to discuss themes and ideas and takeaways and reminders and lessons learned, that type of thing. However, I always put a PGN of the game in the show notes. So if you do want to copy and paste it into an engine to actually look at the game at a later time, you're welcome to do that. You don't have to, but it's there. I know some of you like to do that. So for whoever's interested, you can check out the PGN. So my opponent here was rated about 2075, something like that, maybe a little less. I just realized as I'm recording this, I forgot to write his rating down. Not a big deal. I'll put it in the show notes. But he was an expert level player, 2,000 and change. So a higher rated opponent. He opened with the English opening. So I was black. He played C4. And then I responded with B6, B as in boy, which is one of my favorites. That's what I usually reply to. Sometimes after C4, I'll also do knight F6. And our game, after one C4, B6, it transposed into a Nimo Indian, which is always my goal, and it's very common. Whenever someone opens with c4, it's extremely common that it will transpose into a standard queen's pawn opening because why? c4 is normally played after d4 anyway. So that's very common. So I was happy with that. If you can transpose your opponent's opening into one that you know, that's always good. So it turned into kind of a Nimo Indian type of structure. He did something interesting, which you usually don't see in like a Nimo type thing. Maybe, but I mean, not often. He castled on the opposite side. When that happens, it ends up being a race. It ends up being a battle because what happens is since the pawns you would use to attack his king are not the pawns in front of your king, it's opposite sides, you can simply go for an all-out attack, right? Because obviously if both kings are on the same side, if you move your kingside pawns to attack his king, you're weakening your own king. So with opposite side castling, you obviously can start a pawn storm without weakening your own king because your king's on the other side. And usually it's a question of who's going to get the initiative, who's going to break through first. So when you decide to castle queenside or on the opposite side of your opponent, you have to look at the next move. You have to say, okay, if I castle on the opposite side, can he get the jump on me? And in this case, I could a little bit. So he castled on the opposite side. He castled queenside, and I hit in the center immediately. And another very, very important point, when you castle queenside, we're going to take it from White's point of view, you need to take a moment or take a tempo to move your king to b1. That's a very, very important consolidating move. And sometimes black can take advantage because white has to waste a tempo to do that. The reason is when you castle queenside, there's now two squares next to your king, and that can be vulnerable from attack by your opponent. So by moving the king from c1 to b1, you're now covering that a1 square. And you're also moving the king a little bit further away from the center. So when you castle queenside, especially, it's not so much opposite side castling, but when you castle queenside, it's really two moves because after you castle queenside, you then have to move your king over to b1 at some point. That's generally a required consolidating move so that your king is not vulnerable there. So that's one advantage I had. I was castled kingside and my opponent was castled queenside. And I was able to get the jump on him a little bit. Now, it's interesting. I got a slight initiative with these pawn breaks I mentioned, but it was still fairly even. And it was the kind of position, and this happens all the time. So remember, I had black, my opponent was white. I think during the game that we both thought I was better as black. I mean, I did think that during the game, and I think he did too, because at a glance, it looked that way. And I think that certainly helped me, because remember, it's all about perception. It doesn't matter what the computer says. If both of us think that my position is better, then that's what matters, even if it's not. In fact, he said after the game that he didn't really like his position for most of the game. But it's funny, when I computer checked it at home, it turns out that it's still pretty even. And this happens all the time where both players are convinced that, oh yeah, you were definitely better, or, you know, you were better, or I was worse. Both players think that, and then you put it in the computer and you're wrong. But again, for over-the-board chess, it's all about perception. So both myself and my opponent thought I was a bit better here, even though I wasn't. But that certainly helped me psychologically. The other theme with this game, again, I'm not going to discuss specific moves. It ended up being a draw. So I drew my higher-rated opponent, and I actually ended up making the draw offer. But I want to talk about draw offers for a minute. You know, it's something I'm fascinated about. Now, despite the fact that I speak about draw offers a lot, and despite the fact that I do believe that knowing when to offer or accept a draw can really help your rating in the long term, I really don't like draws. And as I'm listening back to some past episodes, I'm wondering, like, it almost sounds like I'm like pro draw, like I like them and I want them. I really don't. I really don't like draw offers. I want to win, but I don't agree that you should have a policy where you never, ever, ever offer or accept a draw. I think that's wrong. But as a last resort, I think it can be a very, very smart play in certain contexts. And the reason I'm mentioning it here, and if you look at the game separately, you'll see what I mean. all the conditions were in place for me to offer the draw. This was an excellent example of a draw offer. Of course, I would have liked to win. And when he castled Queenside and I got that a little bit of an initiative, I thought maybe I had something there. But as we both got into severe time pressure, I just couldn't see the win. It was just because there was a lot going on. There was a lot to calculate. So here's why I felt it was a good draw offer, because all the boxes were checked for it to be a good draw offer, especially against a high-rated opponent. So number one, we were both in time pressure. We had about 3 to 4 minutes each in a position that needed lots of calculation, especially if you want to push for the win. It was minor piece, rook and pawns, very tricky ending, a lot going on. Now, it turns out at the end, where I felt I was a little bit better, where we both felt I was a little bit better, but it was even, that was kind of in the middle game. As we got to the end game, he was definitely much better. He was about like 1 point something on the computer, not crushing, but he was definitely better. And as it turns out, I had to give up a pawn because of his tactical threat. I would have lost a piece. Here's the thing. I give up a pawn. I had to leave a pawn hanging in order to not lose a piece. And he could have taken the pawn with his rook, but he chose to move his king instead and not take the pawn. And it's funny, I'm looking at it, I'm like, if he takes the pawn, he definitely has winning chances, but he didn't do it. And the computer agrees with me, he should have taken the pawn. But I guess I had some threats of my own. He thought I was going to penetrate. He moved his king towards the center. He consolidated his king instead. We're both in time pressure, number one. Number two, he was definitely better, because it's always a good idea to offer a draw in time pressure if you think your opponent is a bit better and you might lose. Obviously, you're not going to offer the draw if you think you're winning. Number three, I could tell he was a bit nervous. Although he was better, I still had, as I said, some potential threats, and the position is by no means fully clear. So maybe he was overthinking it. As I said before, my read was correct, which is that during the game, he was feeling very insecure about his position, even though he was a bit better here. The other thing, offering a draw with those conditions in place puts tremendous pressure on your opponent, because if he denies it, he's now under increased pressure to win. So if he says, no, I'm not going to take your draw, all the pressure is on him to win, because he's basically saying, no, I think I can win it. And again, that's a lot of pressure. A lot of guys, they sort of break down psychologically. The offer of the draw is not only to escape losing and get the half point against the higher rated opponent, it messes with his head a little bit. I sometimes call that an offensive draw offer. I don't like draws. If I felt I could have won this game and that I was better and I saw a way out, I would have definitely hung in there. But again, we both have about 3 minutes on the clock at this point. Even with the 10-second delay, that's still not a lot of time. I offered the draw, and he actually accepted fairly quickly, even though he was a bit better. And it's funny, right after he accepted the draw, he actually said he didn't like his position for most of the game. So I guess I had a little bit of a psychological edge, which certainly led him to accept it. It doesn't matter if you're better or if you're worse, it's what you think and what your perception is. So it was a very interesting game from a psychological point of view. So to sort of wrap this up with the draw offer, if you're both in time pressure, if you think your opponent is a bit better, but there's still a lot going on and a lot of calculation, and if he seems a little insecure about his position, that's a great time to offer the draw. Now, if I had fought through this and continued going, who knows what would have happened. Now, if my opponent was rated, the same as me or lower, I would not have offered the draw. If my opponent were lower rated, I definitely would not have offered the draw. But again, you're looking at draw odds. So it was the kind of thing where even if he didn't accept the draw offer, I would have been okay with that. I would have played on. And I think it might have been a draw anyway. It kind of just smelled like a draw, because even though he was a bit better, there's still some calculation that has to happen. And with 3 minutes left, it was a good draw offer. Of course, I wanted to win, but I was very happy with that. I was a bit better out of the opening. Then it was kind of even. And then when we accepted the draw, he was definitely better. So it all worked out. But a very interesting game from a psychological point of view. So that will do it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.